they say the more you love, the deeper the grief. And that's true. That's true. And that's also even for toxic relationships, by the way, whether they're platonic or not. At the core of it, there was love. And to go back to that love and to kind of surrender to what is no longer there, or what could have been and what should have been, and the unfinished business.
Yeah.
And that's where, like the forgiveness and the anger, it plays a huge, huge, huge role into living. It's like how, for me, it's like grieving is living. I can't continue live a full, prosperous, joyful, loving life if I haven't grieved.
Yeah.
And so for me, I, see grieving as living. And I personally choose to live a full life.
Welcome to Third Culture Therapy, a podcast that sits at the intersection of mental health and culture, and where I speak with people from different walks of life, different backgrounds, to find out what they take from their particular social identity to help with their mental and emotional well-being. Today, I have with me guest, the beautiful Hana El-Rais. I'm really grateful for you being here. I know you've had a very busy few months, which we will get to very soon. But before I launch into our conversation, a bit of an introduction about yourself for our listeners. Hana is a British-Libyan grief counsellor and end-of-life carer. Hana runs monthly grief circles called Permission to Grieve and works with clients also one-to-one. Using a creative and holistic approach, including vibrational sound medicine, Hana strives to create a safe space for people to address and heal their loss. Hana draws on her practice of Sufism, an esoteric and spiritual interpretation of Islam, as well as her own personal healing journey and the losses experienced in her own life to help others. As a space holder, her niche is overcoming trauma and processing grief through the understanding of the mind, body, and spirit connection. Since the ongoing bombardment of Gaza began a few months ago, Hana has been holding grief circles for members of the Arab and Palestinian community, of which I know many, many, many people are very, very grateful to have been a part of, and grateful to you for the space that you created. So thank you very much for joining me today on Third Culture Therapy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the beautiful introduction.
Well, it's true. It's all you.
No. Thank you.
I want to start by asking you how you identify yourself culturally or in any other way that is important to you. I've indicated a few things: your profession, your faith, your countries that you come from. What do you most strongly identify with?
A human, to start with. I think it's the most important thing. That's where we start. Is this, we're spiritual beings having a human experience, is the way I view life. But in this reality, this physical reality, we're human beings. So before being North African, before being Libyan, before being Muslim, before being British, I'm just a human being. And that for me is really important. Sometimes when we forget our humanity and we really focus on identity and labels, it can ostracize us and it can ostracize other people. And sometimes to be able to have an open heart and an open mind, we need to be able to take ourselves out of the identities that we do attach ourselves to, even if we're attached to them in a really healthy, grounding way and a really loving, beautiful, nourishing way. It's also really good to step out of them to be able to relate to one another on a very human level.
It makes a lot of sense the way you've described it. It seems like a very obvious thing, but I can also see how that has been maybe unwittingly eroded through the over-identification aspect. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Like you do want to be
100%.
recognizing unique aspects of your identity,
Sure.
and have that cared for and seen.
For sure.
But yeah, questioning whether it is coming at the expense of the universal human experience. In the last few months, many of us have been crying out for the recognition of humanity, the universality of humanity,
Right.
regardless of where you're from,
Right.
what you believe in, etc. We're begging for, hey,
Yeah.
can you just see me as a human?
Yeah.
So actually, I think it was incredibly poignant that was what you said, because perhaps prior I would have taken it a bit as a given,
Right.
and actually, it turns out.
It's not.
It's not, or
Exactly.
we've forgotten that it should be. And yes, that is very problematic in many ways. So, and, I thank you for that response and kind of bringing it back to that. From a cultural perspective, though, you do have these two elements, Libyan and British.
Yeah.
Can you describe a little bit your relationship with Libya? And maybe also tell us a little bit about it. I mean, I obviously know, but it's funny, Libya, of most of the Arabic-speaking countries, tends to be quite opaque for people. They don't tend to know that much about it.
Yeah.
So I think it would just be nice as well for our listeners and
for sure.
give us a feel.
I'm definitely not an expert on the topic of Libya, but it's really rich in culture. It's really, really rich in culture in terms of food, in terms of music, and it's very unique. Like when you look at like the Levant area, the Middle East, Syrian cuisine, Palestinian cuisine, Lebanese, it's quite similar. But when you look at North African, actually, they're all very different. Very, very, very different. Like people, say Moroccan food is similar to Libyan. Absolutely not. Completely different. Couldn't be similar at all. So Libyan food is really rich in terms of heavily Italian-based influence because of colonization. Quite spicy, a lot of meat, a lot of rice, a lot of pasta. The music is really, really very African, I would say, more than Arabic. Very, very African with the drums. And it's more like kind of like rapping and poetic. Yeah.
And chanting. It has a chanting.
And chanting. And it's and so that's what makes it unique. I wouldn't actually put it in the genre of Arabic music. I would say it's tribal.
Yeah.
It's tribal.
100%.
It's traditional.
Yeah.
It's unique. Yeah.
And socially, what's it like? How do people interact with one another? I think that you consider them like warm people.
Very.
They are very.
They are.
I mean, I knew that. I fed you.
Yeah, very.
Very warm.
People. Food is everything. Food is a love language. Food is a really big love language. Very generous, I would say. Libyans, generally speaking, extremely generous. It's always, everything is always eccentric. It's always a lot of everything. You will definitely feel at home and feel comfortable around. There's no like, I wouldn't say it's like very formal. I feel like once you're at someone's house, it's like, as they say, like mikasa sukasa, like that kind of vibe.
Having said that, and I did not have as much experience with Libya as you, but obviously my heritage is part Libyan. So I have been a handful of times, and I also, there was a bit of like the Libyan community here in London that I was also had connections to. So one thing I felt, but this might be down to me being not a full Libyan, is that it can be quite cliquey, like quite, they have their, like, warm as they are, there's this like reservation as well, and a bit of a wariness towards outsiders. Yeah,
I think that was like, from my understanding, is that like a lot of Libyans that came to London kept to themselves, didn't really socialize with other Libyan families. People don't know who's pro-Gaddafi. People don't know who's like against Gaddafi. I think it was a very political stance.
That's true. Yeah.
And so like each family to their own, but a lot of families were raised to be aware of this family and that family, or maybe now we're coming to the UK, so we're starting to become a little bit more westernized, and people don't need to know how we live our life, and there's so much happening back home, you don't know who to trust. And we're a small community. There's like 5-6 million Libyans in Libya.
Yeah.
So it was hard to know who to trust and who not to trust. And at the same time, because we're so small, everyone was known. Every family member was really known. Which sounds really strange when you compare it to other North African or Arab cultures. There was some kind of, fear for me. That's how I felt.
No, it's true. I think it's really on point. And just sort of for context for our listeners, that Libya was under the military dictatorship of Muammar Gaddafi for 42 years. It was a very repressive and violent regime. And it extended beyond its borders. So not only was it repressive towards Libyans in Libya, he also had these so-called international death squads that would be sent abroad to assassinate. Here in London, happened several times. This cloak of fear that you talk about is very real. It wasn't just a paranoia.
No, absolutely. You couldn't, you couldn't speak openly, politically.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, how do you suss out if you can trust that person or not? And, it was like the 90s. So everyone was very politically aware. And there was a lot happening.
Yeah.
There was a lot happening. And as you said, like it was happening here in the UK, in London. So I think because people were fleeing away from that and coming here and starting their new life, and or some were actually still working there and going back and forth. So family members were just like, okay, we don't mix, or we only mix with a handful of people that we knew from Libya, because there were families maybe that were here from before.
Yeah.
It just, I don't know, I guess it just felt safer. I mean, yeah.
How's your relationship with Libya? And how has it maybe changed over the years, if at all?
It definitely has changed. I think growing up, I really didn't like it. I was forced to go as a kid. We'd spend our summer holidays there. As a kid, it was like, why would you do that? I want to travel the world. Like, khalas, I don't want to see my relatives.
Yeah.
Culturally, I never felt Libyan. I always felt British. But then when I would come here, I would always feel like I'm not British. I always felt like an outsider, to be honest with you, in so many different ways. I think I only really started to appreciate it when the war happened in 2011. And I think when I also was just growing up and really starting to understand that I'm not British.
Right.
And I'm also not Libyan.
Right.
And that's okay. And I get to pick and choose what I love about being Libyan and what I love about being British. That was quite a journey. I think definitely in my teens, growing into my 20s was an identity crisis for sure, of like, I don't fit in here. Who am I? And then I realized that it's really weird to hate your own culture. It's very strange. It's really strange because I look at other people and they love their culture, they love their food, they love their music, they love their people, they, and like they talk about it and it's great. And I'm like, effing and blinding and like cussing and like, it's a shit show and this and that. And, and then what a bizarre concept. And then I realized that I'm judging it based on an experience that essentially my parents have presented to me.
Interesting.
And so when I went back again, I said to myself, I'm not going to let any outside projection make me have a judgment on this country. I said to myself, you know what? I'm actually going to travel to Libya as if I'm a foreigner.
Yeah.
And experience it for myself. And so to do that, before I did that trip, I actually spent some time reading about Libya and looking into it and looking at the different tribes and understanding the music, the lineage, the wars, the trauma, speaking to my family about, you know, their lineage and what they went through, and asking to see old photos and, you know, before Muhammad Gaddafi and when the Italians were there. And it started to shift. It started to change. I started to feel deep empathy and sadness for what could have been and what should have been.
Yeah.
And I think once I started to realize that, like, when you have your own experience, it's very healing than just having it projected onto you.
Yeah.
And so when I went back, I saw it in a very, very different light.
I get that feeling and that journey. I also similarly grew up. I didn't have as much experience with Libya, but it is very significant in my family's, obviously, history and lineage. But I always, I had a negative association. I've just thought this is where trouble, you know, exists, and where trauma was generated, and where bad things happened to my family or family members. So, not quite through visits, but actually in a way, similar journey, what you did. Because I'm writing this book, I've been doing a lot of research on Libya. And so reading again about it and understanding it a bit more, recognizing a lot of the horrors that have been endured in that country, I gained a lot more understanding and empathy. And while I'm also like, it's not for me, but obviously I grew up here and there are many elements to that, I was less, again, as you said, I didn't hate it. I wasn't angry at it anymore. There was a lot more space for forgiveness, because I guess I had also healed through that knowledge.
Yeah. One more thing that I do and have loved to learn about Libya and Libyan people is we're firecrackers.
That's true.
We're firecrackers. And honestly, I actually love it about us. And we have a great sense of humor.
That's very true.
And those are the two things that I've learned to really love. And it's a very unique sense of humor. And what I love about it is nobody really understands our dialect. So you can crack the most inappropriate joke and not many people will get it.
That's true.
And the firecracker, it's a healthy firecracker.
So your work as a grief counselor and as an end-of-life carer, can you tell us how you got into this field of work?
Yeah. I definitely didn't choose it. It definitely wasn't something that I aspired to be or get into at all. Growing up, I worked in so many different fields. And towards the end, I really just hated what deep passion my job. And I started to recognize that I wanted to just work for myself, but I didn't know what that was. Took a break from that. And
what was it?
I was working for an embassy at the time.
Oh, okay.
I've done fashion, I've done marketing events, I've worked for beauty brands, and so many different jobs, and had my hands in so many different fields. But essentially, you know, that kind of 9 to 5, Monday to Friday just wasn't serving me. I actually started off with food. So my brother got diagnosed with cancer, and we wanted to treat it holistically. He had tried to treat it with Western medicine and it wasn't working. We'd done a lot of research, and I was doing all the diets that he was doing to support, and I became plant-based as a result of it. And I did chef training. I got really into it, and I just thought, this is my calling, you know, and I was doing that. And basically, when he had passed away, I completely lost my passion for food, completely stopped cooking. And there was a massive, massive, massive grievance with that. And I still don't cook in the same way that I used to. And when I was grieving myself and going through that as a loss, as well as losing my brother himself, losing a friendship, losing my passion and not knowing what I want to do in life. And you know, I had lost a friend of mine to suicide. I had lost my body at one point. I had lost my identity, being a third culture kid. So many different types of losses that I kind of sat there and noticed, I've really become friends with grief. A bit too much. I understand this pattern too well. Almost I just knew what to do, not because I studied anything, not because I wanted to be a pro at grief, not because of any of those reasons, but it just felt very natural to me.
Right.
It felt very, very natural. I was always very protective of outside projections, of, you know, always getting unsolicited advice of how you should grieve, what is okay, what isn't okay, culturally, religiously, all the, you know, healthy, not healthy. And I always had very strict boundaries around of like, I know what I'm doing, you know? And after going through a really, really big grief retreat for like 7 days where I had no phone, and it was just me and my therapists, and it was the most intense work that I had ever allowed someone to help me with. And when I came out of that, I was like, I need to do something with this.
Wow.
You know, I was like, this is no longer for me. This is a bittersweet medicine. This is a gift. And I started to notice all the gaps that was missing in our society, and all of the gaps that I wish I had.
Yeah.
All the gaps that I was able to give myself that I know people would really need and benefit from. And so, you know, I decided to create Permission to Grieve, because I felt like we didn't have permission to grieve.
Yeah.
And I felt like even saying that was freeing, like to give myself permission to grieve. Because some of us have to go back to work, or some of us have to be mums or dads, or some of us have, you know, like restrictions that don't allow us to grieve. And I was really fortunate to not have any of those boundaries whilst my brother had passed away. And in other grievances, I did.
Yeah.
And so I had both experiences of what it's like to be restricted and then to not be restricted.
Right.
And I wanted to create a space where you just had the permission. And even if it was just that one circle once a month, you have the permission to be completely yourself, to let go, not wear a mask, to feel, to express, and essentially to be heard, honored, and witnessed. I feel like a lot of the time people, when we're sharing about grief, like they're not really listening, because they're so quick to be like, oh, by the way, when my dad or when my uncle witnessed, like, hang on a second, this person just wants to be heard. You can't change their pain. You can't take away anything from them. You can't help them. It's a journey that they have to go through. They just want to be heard. And there's something really powerful about being honored, heard, and witnessed, and actually not given any advice. And it was really important for me as well to create a space where it wasn't just the loss of a loved one, you know, someone who had physically died. You know, it was, I had also gone through a divorce. So that was a massive grievance in itself. A lot of people go through loss of relationships, you know, whether it's platonic or not.
Yeah, I mean, definitely get to different types of grief in a moment. I first want to say I'm really, really sorry for all of the losses that you've endured and your dear brother.
Thank you.
That's very difficult. You don't expect it. Not that losing a grandparent is less painful, but there is that expectation. I think siblings at such a young age. For those who are able to channel it, they find that, gosh, there's a big gift at the end of it. But I think that's also why all the more important the process of grief and how you go through it. Now, you spoke about how you'd experienced like two different versions, one where you were really free and open to be, and one where you weren't, less so, you were more constrained. Can you give like an example of what you mean by what looks like open, free grief for you, or in general, and what was the other version?
So the first version, I would say, is age.
Okay.
That plays a huge role. So I was young, I was more vulnerable, I knew less about myself, I was afraid to ask for help, I was drowning in shame and guilt. Society teaches us that vulnerability is weak. So even as a woman, like, you know, I was afraid. And I was also raised in a house with 4 brothers, so 5 men in the house. So I was quite a tough cookie as a kid, you know. So there was that. Plus then I would say I was in a relationship. I was married at the time. I was also working. You know, my parents at the time had some health cares. So responsibility was huge. So I didn't really have the space, the capacity, and I didn't allow the support. So I would say I didn't allow the support from maybe my own kind of childhood experiences, you know, my own inner child playing up of like, you know, being afraid to be seen and heard and being vulnerable. And I would say responsibilities when you're working full time, when you have a partner, when, you know, if you're looking after your parents, if someone is sick, we tend to shove everything down. Yeah. You know, and I was definitely a people pleaser. So it was. And
presumably this is when your brother died.
No,
this was you're talking earlier.
This was another. So yeah. I didn't have, but I also didn't allow myself. Yeah. You know, and that tends to be the case for a lot of people. Because we use the excuse of I'm working full time, and that's relevant, but to an extent. And so that was one experience. And when my brother passed away, I knew that no longer served me. Okay. And I was like, that didn't work. I can't do it this way.
How did you know it didn't work? Just out of curiosity. How did you know? Was it that it just...
Because I knew it didn't work because I would still feel anger. Okay. And the discomfort would be there. And I didn't welcome any of it in. So I was like, no, that didn't work. It didn't serve me. Yeah. And I also didn't, it wasn't smooth sailing in the sense of, for me, it looks very different to everyone. But for me, it wasn't smooth sailing it was toxic. Yeah. Okay. It was toxic. Yeah. It was definitely toxic. But when my brother had passed away, I felt like I had more control and I felt like I created space and I sought help and I studied and I gave myself the full utmost permission to be sad and to not let outside projections, you know, kind of sway me otherwise. And it felt very organic and natural as opposed to like controlled. In a toxic kind of way. Wow. It was challenging, for sure. There were definitely moments. I mean, I went into deep depression. I went into deep depression. But when I was into that deep depression, I knew I had to be there. I think because the grief had started before he had passed, and as he was going through cancer, that when he had passed away, it was almost like, finally I can be sad, because the previous years I had to be strong and positive and enthusiastic and hold a brave face. And I was holding on so much that I was so happy that I could finally be sad. Yeah. That it felt like a gift in a way. And I was very vocal about that. I was very, very vocal about that. There were times where I thought, you know, I don't know if I'm going to get out of this. And I was scared a little bit, but I had a good support system. Yeah. Where I'd vocalize that and we would talk things through. And eventually I sought help towards the end. Okay. And that's what got me out of the drowning. Wow. I wasn't prepared to stay drowning for too long. And I had drowned for a long period of time, but I needed that. I don't think I would be okay if I hadn't gone through that level of depression.
I can understand from the perspective of someone who didn't do it in that order. I definitely say that when my dad died, I bypassed grief for a very long time. I was like, oh, well, it's done. What can you do? Yeah. I went straight into acceptance. Yeah. And then, honestly, it was years later that, I mean, in the interim, I could see some chinks happening. But then years later, the drowning that happened, and then the grief, and then you really realize that you can't escape grief. Like you just can't. It's just going to come for you. So you may as well decide, like, when are you going to
And that's what I wasn't prepared for.
Yeah, that was what you weren't prepared for.
No, I was like, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to wait for it to bite me in the ass.
Exactly.
I'm not doing that.
Exactly.
That's what I was not interested in doing.
Yeah, well done you.
Because I was like, I've done this before too many times. It's ugly. It's not fun. I'm not interested in doing that. I'm here now, you know. I also didn't have the responsibilities that I had previously. You know, I wasn't married. I didn't have the full-time job. I had to quit. I was like, this is this is an opportunity. Like, how could I, then what, wait in the future for if I do end up with someone or do have kids and then wake up one day and being like, oh my God, he's passed. And no.
Yeah. Did you grieve your divorce as well? Or
yeah,
you did?
Yeah. And I think because I had fully grieved my divorce and kind of like crossed the bridge, got into the other side of it, that when my brother did go through cancer and did eventually did pass, it felt so good to have crossed the bridge with the divorce that I was like, okay, it's the right thing to do.
You had space for it.
I had space for it. And like, yes, life does continue, and that's a really painful lesson that you learn when you're grieving, because your life literally stops, but the rest of the world continues. And it's very hard. It's very trippy. It's very weird to witness. And it's very isolating.
Yeah.
Even if you have support, you have family, you have therapy, or if you don't, it's a very isolating experience, because even if you're grieving the same person, so the way I processed it was very different to how my mom processed it.
Yeah.
But that's due to her experience with my brother. I experienced him one way, she experienced him another way, his friends experienced him in another way, his son experienced him in another way. So we're going to grieve in a different way, and we feel in different ways. So there's no room for comparison. There's no room for comparison. And so if we understand that we experience people in one way, therefore we grieve them in another way, and we can't compare them in another way, then we shouldn't be solicited to be able to tell people how to process it.
How would you advise people to process it without, I suppose, going into the realm of telling people what to do? But I suppose you this is your space. So what is the right way, quote unquote, right way?
Right. I mean, so for some people, they go through all the different layers potentially in 1 hour or one day. For some people, they stay in one space for a really long time.
What spaces are those we're talking about?
So the main kind of core emotions are sadness, anger, and fear. Those are the three core emotions.
Okay.
And you can feel all three in one day, or you can 1 hour or 1 week. But sometimes, a lot of the times, people tend to stay in the same emotion for quite a long period of time, and it's important to move through each emotion. And it depends on what your previous life experiences are and how you've dealt with that.
In relation, you spoke about these emotions, and you're sort of encouraging of people to feel them, but that they can cycle through them in different stages. So how would you help people in that regard?
I think the most important thing for me is to be able to understand. So the thing is, with grief, if we understand it to be so you have your core initial grief that you're experiencing, right? Let's say somebody is grieving the loss of their loved one. When you start to grieve that, one of the reasons why it's so difficult is you go through secondary losses. Right. So you start to then maybe you lose your job, or you lose a friendship, or, whatever it is, or you lose your body. Some people gain or lose weight, or, you go through secondary losses, and it becomes really challenging where they don't understand why these secondary losses are coming from. And the result of that is it's unprocessed grief.
Right.
So the main core initial grief kind of triggers the unprocessed grief. So for me, it's really important to understand the person's unprocessed grief.
Right.
Before I can even understand the first initial grief. And we kind of work backwards. So it tends to go into your childhood. Right. So we start from that. So we try to understand what went wrong, what happened, what we haven't processed. How has this manifested, whether it's into the body, whether it's into your mind. So whether you're a really angry person, the root of anger is sadness. So what is it you're really sad about? Because you're not really angry. You're sad about something that you haven't grieved. So let's tackle that. And once we can actually have an understanding, or I can have an understanding of this person's essentially childhood and background and unprocessed grief, then I am able to then look at the bigger picture of what is currently happening. And with the core initial grievance that they're experiencing. And I look at it from a holistic perspective. So I look at it from 3 bodies. So the mind, the body, the spirit. The grief manifests into the body. So I also, I'm able to recommend whether they have acupuncture done, whether they are able to work with a herbalist, a nutritionist. So how they, a somatic healer. So they're able to release the energy through the body. I don't believe that it's just talking therapy that's going to help you to overcome or heal. It also needs to be released through the body. It also needs to be released spiritually, whatever practice that is for the person, for them to, give that heaviness and that grief back to God, the universe, the earth, whatever it is.
I know this is very individual, but
yes,
I guess what would seem to you like a healthy processing of grief over a healthy period of time?
Time is a difficult one.
Yeah.
That looks very different. For everyone.
Yeah.
So, and I never really talk about time because people are so fixated on getting to the other side. So we never talk about time.
Yeah.
That's my rule. My way of it.
Fair.
There is something called prolonged grief, which is where you are stuck in the same emotion for 2 years.
Okay.
That's challenging.
Okay.
And that's a whole different thing on itself.
Oh, that's not what you would do or work on.
I would work on that with people.
Okay.
But it's that's prolonged grief.
Okay.
It's there's grief and then there's prolonged grief.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is at what point, what are the indicators or bell signs that someone should go to you? Or should everyone who's suffering grief find a counselor to guide them through it?
Yeah. I would say if you are if you're isolating, if you're consciously isolating yourself, because we consciously do that.
Okay.
And by isolating, I mean not vocalizing how you are experiencing things. So if you're being invited to a social event and you've just lost someone and you're feeling really anxious about it and you don't have the courage to let your friend know, you're consciously isolating and suppressing and pushing emotions down. If you're going to work when you're not ready to go to work and you're forcing yourself to work, understandably, you have to pay bills, but there are ways around that. Yeah. There are also ways around that. There are constantly new laws and regulations around that are changing as well. And that's really important. So, and also people use it as a form of escapism. If you're finding yourself that you're using ways of escapism because out of fear, it's so normal, it's so natural, and it's okay to do that. But if you're spending months that lead into years doing that and you're not addressing it, it's time to see someone. And also the biggest thing is if it's manifesting through your behavior.
Right.
So you're now becoming bitter.
Right.
You're now you're closing your heart and you're not allowing yourself to love or be loved. You're no longer approachable. You're angry. You're defensive. Of course, if it's, also causing you, sleepless nights, anxiety, stress, like all of that, by the way, can be happening at the same time. It doesn't have to just be one thing or the other. I mean, for example, I didn't leave my room for 18 weeks.
Wow. 18 weeks.
That was
4 months?
Yeah. That was intense.
That's intense.
That was intense. That was really intense. And if I didn't, and I had amazing friends. I had amazing friends that were there, like physically there, not just on the phone, like that were physically there. But I was terrified. I had developed such, fear, and I recognized that I needed help. And if I didn't take that, I wouldn't be sitting here with you and I wouldn't be doing the work that I'm doing. And I equally needed to be in that level of drowning and fear and sadness, because I don't think I would feel joy in the same way that I do now.
Yeah.
And I don't think I would appreciate life or love. And I don't think I would have taken up this work. I don't think I would have. And I didn't want to be bitter and I didn't want to be angry. I had swam so deep in that for so many years. I refused to let any of it overtake me. You feel it here. right in your chest. You know, you really feel it right in your chest. And through Chinese medicine, we're taught that grief lays within your lungs, right? And from a spiritual perspective, it's in your heart, which is where your spirit is. And you ultimately know yourself. Like, you know, and this is why we isolate ourselves, because we can't hide from ourselves. So you know ultimately that something's not okay.
Yeah.
And that your life has changed. And if you're not able to get up out of bed and you're not able to face people that you love, forget work, people that you love and that you used to feel safe and comfortable around, now you don't feel comfortable and safe around them, and the world is really dark, how long are you going to stay in that place for? I always say that, you know, it's the one who wants to work with their grief, you got to want to do it.
Yeah.
You have to, you're the one that has to do the work.
That's true.
Like, you have to want to do it.
Yeah.
You have to want to cross the other bridge, the other side.
That's true. You do have to want to cross over to the other side, because it's not a fun ride.
It's horrible.
It's
absolutely horrendous.
Not put people off.
It's great.
It's not bad. No, it is horrible. You're right. It's horrible. It's really painful. But the truth is, when you do get to the other side, you're so relieved.
Yeah.
And you realize what it was for. Like, you get it. Like, I see, this pain really was serving a very important purpose. This loss was also make me really value what I had. I mean, one of the things that I'm grateful for, having finally adequately processed my grief about losing my dad years after he died, was that now I can think about him joyfully.
Right.
Like, whereas I couldn't before.
Right.
I would get always bothered.
Right.
And I would feel like it was a little bit of combination of angry and sad colliding in a very ugly feeling that I just didn't want to, you know, address. Yeah. So I was not comfortable talking about him. I was not comfortable bringing it up, because I just didn't know, is this going to trigger me? I'm going to start getting upset and uncomfortable. Whereas having actually delved into it and processed it, now I'm like, the biggest gift it's given me is that I can now think about it and be like, oh, yeah, nice. You know, I have these beautiful memories, and they came back, and they were inaccessible to me for many years because I didn't realize that at the time. Yeah. But then I came to afterwards.
Yeah, because on the other side of grief is love.
Yeah.
That's the reality of it. You know, it's like, you know, they say the more you love, the deeper the grief. And that's true. That's true. And that's also even for toxic relationships, by the way, whether they're platonic or not. At the core of it, there was love. And to go back to that love and to kind of surrender to what is no longer there, or what could have been and what should have been, and the unfinished business.
Yeah.
And that's where, you know, like the forgiveness and the anger, it plays a huge, huge, huge role into living. It's like how, for me, it's like grieving is living. I can't continue to live a full, prosperous, joyful, loving life if I haven't grieved.
Yeah.
And so for me, I, you know, see grieving as living.
Yeah.
I see that without grieving any of these losses, I'm not fully living a full life. And I personally choose to live a full life, you know?
That makes sense. I like the way you put it, grieving is living. And you're absolutely right. I think the lessons that you take from it definitely make for a more full life. In the Arab world or in the Middle East, the mourning, the grief process is there's quite a nice structure to it that I find is very helpful. There is this 3-day intense mourning period where people are coming, you know, there's the burial, and then there's the people coming to your house, but then there's also like an elongated 40 days. Yeah. And there is, within that, these 3 days and there's 40, and the people coming in, and there being another aspect of recognizing on the 40th day of someone's passing that is also an occasion. That there is within that very much a permission to grieve. What do you think?
No, I don't disagree. I think it's, there's layers to it.
Yeah.
I think there's layers to it. I think it's really beautiful having people come over and they bring food and the house is full and there's a lot of people and people are in and out, and essentially you're not left alone. But what I found really difficult about it is no one's actually speaking to you.
That's true.
No one's actually asking, how are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
It's always like, oh, ma'lish, oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
Allah yarhamu.
Yeah.
You know, he's in a better place.
Mm-hmm.
We're straight away doing this, compressing. We're not really asking, how are you getting on? Are you showering? Are you looking after yourself? We're not really asking direct questions. How are you sleeping? You know, are you having any dreams? You know, what is it you need help with? Okay, it's amazing that people bring food over. It's great to have food in the house and to keep people nourished. But we're not really directly speaking to people. And it's more of, I find, unless like they're your besties and your family, it's more of like an obligation. And now I have to go and pay my respects to that person, which is a nice cultural thing to do. It's really beautiful and you feel loved. And, you know, obviously there's empathy from people, but the lack of communication I find really annoying. I'm like, because maybe for me, I was so eager to speak. So it's very different to each person, but that's how I found it. I found it annoying. I was like, when are these people going to go home?
Right.
Enough.
Yeah.
You know, and it felt like a social gathering towards the end where I'm having people that I don't know that well, chilling in my house, eating food, asking me where teacups are. And like aunties being like, when is Shay? Like, where's the tea? And I'm like, get out of my house.
Right. Okay.
But I was angry.
Yeah.
And so I didn't feel that I had my space. And that was also really challenging because I was obliged to come and say hello to this person.
Yeah.
They came out of their obligation to say hello to me.
Yeah.
And pay their respects. So it's beautiful, but what I found is that it was overwhelming that there were no boundaries. And being an Arab, there's no boundaries.
Not very many.
And not having no boundaries in grief was really challenging for me. My mum, on the other hand, loved it.
Right.
And it was so therapeutic for her. And it was really helpful for her. And she really needed it. And it was great for her. So it's like, I wish we could have the best of both. Yeah. When it comes to grief in that sense.
Yeah, but it's interesting what I think you kind of actually articulated the nub of the issue there. It's obligation and choice.
Yeah. There's also like, I know there's a start and an end to that day. I know that there's a limit. I know that there's X amount of people coming and that they're my people. Whereas when it's family and it's cultural, it's every person. And you know, I don't know, like it wasn't just Libyans, it was Arabs. And they just say inappropriate stuff sometimes. I'm not going to lie to you.
Yeah.
They do, even at funerals. And I'm just like, do you realize that I'm not okay?
Yeah.
You know, so there's a lack of sensitivity. Whereas, you know, I think like from maybe a Western perspective,
how does that compare?
There's more sensitivity.
Okay.
There is more sensitivity, but there is more fear.
Yes, I was going to say.
So for like, you know, Arab culture, death is not something that's feared.
Yeah, no.
Because for us culturally, Islamically, death is, you know, the start. It's not the end of life. Is that we continue on to the next life. And that they're in a better place. And so there isn't so much of fear. There's more of an understanding and a knowledge and a relationship with death.
Yes.
And so that's really healthy because death is the one lived experience that we will all go through. Loss is the one lived experience that we will all go through. So I find that really healthy.
Yeah.
The fear that the West kind of has is what isolates people and what makes people afraid to talk about the loss of their loved one.
Yeah.
So, you know, I had some of my friends' brothers that where I could tell they were so eager to tell me stories, but they were so afraid to tell me.
That they'd upset you.
That they upset me. And I'm like dying to hear about it. And I'm like, tell me. And they're like, I just don't want to upset you. And it's such a foreign concept to me because I'm like, all I want to do is talk about my brother. All I love to hear is about stories. Why wouldn't you tell me? And I've noticed that, you know, Western culture just, it's easier to move on, quote unquote, move on, suppress, shove it down, don't talk about it, because it creates fear for them to address their unprocessed grief. Or to realize, actually, I might lose someone in the future, or maybe I haven't processed this. And instead of
addressing that, it's so much easier to shush the
Yeah.
other person.
Mm-hmm.
You know, hence us not being able to handle witnessing somebody cry.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I definitely felt that. I remember after Dad died, 6 months later, I was back in London and working, and I definitely felt there was a big difference in terms of how it was received and dealt with. And overwhelmingly, the feeling I got from most of my Western friends was not addressing it.
Yeah.
Just, it didn't have, you know, like to the point where some people, I was just like, this is downright rude. Like, you haven't even said, I'm sorry for your loss. Like,
Yeah.
this is just basic acknowledgement.
Yeah.
But now, years later, and having understood, you know, myself and people better, I realized, God, how fearful must you have been to not have been able to say that? Like, you knew me.
Yeah.
Of course, it would have been natural to say, I'm really sorry you lost your dad. Like, anything I can do, or like, so anything, you know.
Yeah.
And many, not all of them, but many just didn't.
Yeah.
And that was, gosh, I mean, I suppose that also enabled me to also hide and suppress it, because then I, as a result, I guess in a way you feed off, right? Like,
Massively.
If I feel like someone doesn't really want to hear it, then I'm not going to talk about it.
And that's really, And that's
if you're
really,
so afraid to even say, I'm sorry you lost your, of course I'm not going to come to you and be like, I'm having a really tough day.
Of course. And this is the most important thing I always say to people. It's really important that you're selective of who you share your grief with.
Yeah.
It's really important, because you don't want someone to gaslight you. You don't even want advice. You just don't. You just want to be heard, honored, and witnessed. And that's, you know, that can be done by eye contact, by acknowledging, by just literally witnessing the person without giving any advice.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the times we think that we're doing that, but we're not. We're constantly thinking of what is the next thing that is that we want to say to the person.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we make them feel better? You can't. You can't. They just want to tell you that they miss their husband, or whoever it is, that they miss whatever it is that they're going through, or they're having a really rough day. And so it's really important that you're selective and that you know who it is that you're sharing your grief with.
Mm.
And that can be a tough lesson. That's another sucky part of grief, because you might have someone who's really, you know, harsh, you know, like just tells you to go on with it and move on. What are you going to do? And then, you know, that how then are you left with that? Yeah. You know, you might have the opposite. You might have people who spiritually bypass you, where they're like, you know, this is God's will. Mm-hmm. Or the universe's will, like like you've been swimming in this for too long now. You need to, like, you know, pull your socks up and move through this and love and light, basically. And you're like, how do you love and light this?
I mean, a lot of people do love and light it. Yeah, it is. Speaking of love and light, you are also practicing Sufi.
Yes.
How, if at all, has that impacted the way you look at your work, at grief, at life, I suppose, in general? Sufism, I'll let you explain it a bit more, but it is known for being a very spiritual, deeply sort of philosophical, peaceful part of the Muslim religion, and does have quite a presence in Libya that dates a while back. Al-Sanusis, who were the dynasty that ruled Libya for a while, were of the Sufi order, like very famous, well known. So there's like, it exists in Libya, like for a while. How did you come to it? And what have you learned from it? What have you taken from it that has helped you perhaps on this journey? You can explain to us a little bit what it's about.
Yeah, I would say it's a mystical side of Islam. As you said, philosophical, also poetry and focusing. It's Islam, essentially. Yeah. It's the core foundations of it is Islam, but it encompasses the mystical side, so the poetry, the also physics side of Islam, and
movement with the world of dervishes.
100%, a somatic movement, somatic movement being prayer, a form of prayer. And I would also say meditation. Meditation, and, you know, has always been seen as like a westernized thing nowadays, when it's ancient. When it's ancient.
Yeah.
And sadly, a lot of like, when I started learning about meditation, and when I started to learn about visualization, and when I started to study vibrational medicine, and I started to learn about sound, and I was just mesmerized. You know, as you said, Libya is so rich in Sufism, and I started to study about my ancestors and the lineage, and I would speak to my mom, and we would talk about, and I just started, it's going to sound so hippie of me, but so be it. It's all the same.
Yeah.
It's all the same.
Yeah.
And when I started to understand that more and more and more, I felt more at home within my ancestral lineage.
Yeah.
And I felt a deep connection. And I said to myself, I actually don't want to go to the yoga class anymore and be taught by the, you know, lovely white women. I don't. It doesn't serve me. It served me in that period of time. It no longer serves me. And I want to look closer to home. And I was already practicing Islam from a very young age, but I wanted to see the other side that I was so fascinated by, and how it also is practiced within my practice.
Right.
And I found that sound was a huge thing. And I was like, wow, okay. So like I can also learn about sound and teach it and encompass it from an Islamic perspective.
Can you give us some examples? What do you mean?
For example, drumming in North Africa and in the Middle East. Drumming is the sound of the heartbeat. And there's a very specific frequency that's made within drumming, and it's used for healing purposes. That's not just science. That's not just science. That's used across almost every religion, almost every culture, and almost every tribe. It's universal. And I just having that acknowledgement and that understanding for me was freeing.
Yeah.
That I'm not just, you know, trending.
Yeah.
Not that I ever was trying to be, but I just didn't want anything. You know, I was done with this whole like whitewashing kind of like spirituality that almost was kind of like trying to creep in, but I didn't want to be part of because it was weird. But then I loved it at the same time. Another example of sound is the recitation of the Quran or dhikr, which can be known as chanting, you know, chanting the divine names. There's a frequency about the repetition, and, you know, that's really big and seen in Hinduism and in yoga meditations. And I was like, but we do that, you know, and it's the same thing. It's just different language. It's complete, but it's exactly the same thing. Why is this trending? Why am I, you know, like what's going on here? And I started to link all of the, you know, dance, for example. Again, a lot of mainstream Muslims will say, no, and it's not like, you know, it's haram and it's not practiced within Islam. But if you open a book, I don't know what book people read, but
it very much is and has been historically.
And it has been. And so for me, I just was like, at the end of the day, this is ancestral and lineage, first and foremost. Secondly, I've never felt more in love with and felt more comfortable and felt more aligned and at peace and at heart with my practice. And not much has changed.
Right.
And that's what I love. We're so different, and it needs to be different to speak to us all in different ways. Otherwise, it would be a bit boring. And a bit,
I like that, actually, the way you put that. It needs to be different to speak to all of us in different ways. And not only would it be boring, we wouldn't be honoring the unique differences that exist among all of us. If we were all able to receive whatever messages or insight in the same way, then that wouldn't be accepting of our differences fully. So it sounds like a really beautiful journey that you went on. And I like the way that you found the sort of work that you were already doing in sound, vibrational, also kind of reaffirmed from this mystical, spiritual aspect within your own sort of cultural. What do you do with sound and vibrational sound in your work?
So I started off with creating just sound baths. So just, you know, classes, working in different studios in London, working in festivals, working one-to-one with clients, very much just focusing on the instruments, so playing the gong, playing crystal bowls, And I think the more comfortable I got with that, and obviously being brown, Muslim, Arab, most at the time when I first started, it was most white people as practitioners. Now it's a little bit more, but like I was kind of like the odd one out. And you had people starting classes with namaste and chanting and making it their own, even though it wasn't their own. I don't care, no filter.
No filter here.
I started to incorporate, reciting passages from the Quran.
Nice.
I started to incorporating dhikr into it, making it completely my own. Specifically, to begin with, working with people who have experienced grief through sound. That was really important to me. From a traumatic, if had traumatic experiences, releasing any visualizations that no longer, or any PTSD that would come up, or any dreams. That was something that I gained from sound, and that what made me want to study and learn more about the physics of how it moves through the body and how the energies are released through the body, as well as from a religious perspective or a spiritual perspective. It was really important for me to actually understand the physics behind it. Essentially, our whole body is made up of energy. So if we understand that we are made up of atoms, and each of these atoms vibrate at a frequency. So when we're feeling low or when we're feeling high, they're changing. They're constantly shifting and changing the frequencies within our body. Right? And so, for example, when you're witnessing a sunset, or you're in nature, or you're around animals, we match the same frequencies as nature.
Right.
So even if we're feeling really, really sad, or really intense, or really whatever the emotion is that you're feeling, the frequency within your atoms in your body, they're going to shift and change because we match the same frequency as nature.
Okay.
Right? So sound healing works with specific frequencies of each instrument to help shift and change the frequencies within our body to come to a more harmonious state of mind. And so sound is the quote-unquote quickest way to get into a meditative state of mind.
Okay.
You skip the whole kind of focusing on your breath. I mean, you start that way. But sometimes it's really difficult for people to get into a meditative state of mind, especially if they're not practicing any form of meditation.
Yeah.
But the instruments kind of zaps you into that.
Yeah.
Especially if you do it regularly. And if it doesn't, it's also a really great way to relax the body. It doesn't always have to be with just working through trauma and grief and loss. It can also just be a deeply relaxing, nourishing experience that will just reharmonize the body, essentially.
The last few months for many of us have been incredibly harrowing and challenging. For you, being a professional in grief counseling, this is very poignant and relevant because there's a lot of grief. There's a lot of grief for the thousands, the tens of thousands of Palestinian lives that have already been killed. And then there's all of the secondary griefs that we are also experiencing. Loss of identity, loss of safety, loss of humanity, loss upon loss, loss of friendships, loss of work. A lot of losses and illusion, just many. And you have been very kindly, generously offering grief circles for people within the community to be able to grieve in safety and in solidarity, I guess, with others. Why did you decide to put those on, and how was that experience for you?
I felt like it was vital. I felt like it was so essential more than ever. I've never felt more compelled or more humbled to hold such a circle. I've also never been in such a difficult situation myself. It was one of the hardest spaces I've ever and probably will ever have held in my life. More than anything. It was unimaginable. And that was really strange as a space holder. because I mean, I've never been pregnant or lost a child, but in all the clients that I take, I'm able to relate to their experiences. But when I, am working with people that have lost 30 people, it's you as a profession, you question yourself. Am I even the right person for this person? But then you look around, and what else are you supposed to do when a collective is going through something other than help? And that's what I took from those experiences, is when I would question myself of, am I even the right person to hold such a space? Because I've never been a person that's, lost from a genocide. Who am I? Why me? But then I noticed at this point, everything and anything helps. Everything and anything helps. And it was something so empowering about being in a circle with Palestinians, North Africans, Middle Eastern people, and having the freedom to also bring politics, the grief of politics into it, talking about our ancestors, giving voice to their names, saying that we're angry about these governments, really talking about the things that even us as a community are afraid to talk about.
Yeah.
Even amongst ourselves. I've never been in such places where we are freely and openly able to share that. But it was important for me to also lift the barrier of, if you want to scream and be angry and, curse at whatever government or whatever person that has fired you or has belittled you or has made you feel the way that you're feeling, or, to give voice and to the person that you've lost in Palestine or in Lebanon or wherever it is, was so vital. I also wanted to hear those people's names. I wanted to take a moment and be in prayer with my brothers and sisters. And so many of those circles were activists,
Yeah.
and it was essential and still is essential for not just people that have lost people, but also as an activist, how can we create space where we're offloading? There's also something really potent and powerful about offloading in community.
Yeah.
You automatically feel less alone.
Our region, the Middle East, North Africa, Swana, no stranger to grief and loss, especially in the last few years. In fact, I was reflecting on the fact that we were going to talk, and we both have Libyan heritage. And a month before October, there was that horrific flood and dam break in Derna in Libya. I believe over 10,000.
Yeah.
I feel, when I think about it every so often, I feel really guilty that I actually wasn't able to mourn and grieve those lives as fully as I would have liked.
Yeah.
Because straight after there was Palestine and all of the Palestinian lives, and they're still being killed daily. And so there is no, unfortunately,
there's no pause.
And I wonder, how do we deal with that, the compounding and sort of relentless losses that we are experiencing as a collective and a community?
Something that I've been in my own community, been really vocal about, that it's sometimes quite hard for people to listen to, and it's like each to their own. But it's really essential that we take breaks, healthy breaks, from how much we are consuming. If we don't actually take healthy breaks, because you're consuming trauma from a screen, it's very, very intense, and we have been really desensitized to, and really, we don't even have time to realize what we're actually witnessing. You and I now, and like many people, are very used to seeing limbs on a screen.
Yeah.
That's beyond not normal.
Thankfully, I'm not used in the sense that I'm
not used to it, but you
kind of... I couldn't anymore. Personally, right. I couldn't.
Right, but people just
saw it as just harmful.
People just swipe, and they're swiping, and they're looking through, and then they put their phone down, and either they carry on with life, or they're not taking time to, sit and actually make, for me, it's making a prayer for that person, actually trying to find out what that person's name is, if we have the access to. Okay, fine, you don't know that person's name, fine. How can you actually sit with what it is you've witnessed? And if you can, then that means you stop. You don't continue on doom scrolling.
Yeah.
It's weird that we're doom scrolling a genocide. And that's not me bypassing the reality of what's happening. I'm not saying don't keep up to date with the news. I'm not saying don't be an activist. I'm doing all those things myself. I'd be a hypocrite if I was to say that. I'm saying it's essential that you either, once you've witnessed that, get up from your seat, release it from your body by doing some shaking. It's something that animals do when they've witnessed trauma. They shake to release the energies out of their body. We need to be shaking every single day, whether it's in the morning, whether it's in the evening, whether it's after you're witnessing what it is on your phone, whatever your practice is. This is the time more than ever to be doing that. But if you continue on doom scrolling, where is this energy going?
Yeah.
What are people doing with their energy of consumption of trauma on a genocide on a screen? And it's challenging.
It's challenging. A lot of people often, they feel guilty. So they, but then I kind of sometimes say, well, the guilt isn't going to serve you or anyone. Also, I actually bring it back down to something. I'm like, listen, humans were not meant to consume this much horror helplessly.
Why not?
So actually, what you're doing is not it's not a bad thing. Like, you're physically not wired for it. We're not made for this.
Why not?
The fact that we're being forced to accept it is the real harm.
And all the movements that I'm also part of as well is amazing, and it shouldn't stop. But there has to be a healthy, limited capacity to all of it, with space and breaks to be able to balance. So the amount that we're consuming, what are we doing to look after ourselves?
Right.
So that we can be in service to these people.
Yeah.
In terms of the acceptance, it's very individual for each person. But accept the grief in itself.
Yeah.
I mean, next podcast when this genocide ends, I don't know. Like, I don't have the answer to that. I feel like no one does. Like, how do we? My teacher, who's been an end-of-life caretaker for 30 plus years and has witnessed endless amount of people pass away, is now adding a new syllabus to the training, and that I also have to retake, of a gratitude, of compassion, of people dying in a hospice. There's a whole nother new level of compassion about it, where now it's seen as a privilege because people are being massacred. Whereas it used to be that you would see someone, if they died alone in a hospice, as a tragedy.
Yeah.
Now that's a luxury.
Yeah.
That's wild to me.
Wow.
Now people dying alone in a hospice is a luxury. What a crazy world we live in.
That it is. It is a very crazy world. But we do have some beautiful moments and people, more importantly, in them. And I thank you very much for your service and what you give to all humans everywhere, just to humanity at large. It is the work of people like you that makes the current very difficult reality we're living bearable. And that's a reality. So thank you very much. And thank you for taking up your precious time to come.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Check out the show notes for more details about my wonderful guests, including where you can find them on social media. If you enjoyed listening to this, please do spread the good word, share with friends, family, cousins, and colleagues, and please, please, please like and leave a review on whatever platform you are listening to this podcast. Your support is crucial for the show's success, and a couple of clicks from you will mean the world to me. Go to my website, leilamaghrabi.com, and follow me on Instagram and Twitter for more news on future episodes.